Welcome to my channel. This is a bit different from the direction I thought I was going to go to for making my YouTube videos. I originally intended to discuss gaming on a small scale, or gaming on the kitchen table as I phrased it. However, as I reflected on my hobby, there are a few things that I want to address that contribute to the miniatures gaming community at large. So I present to you Rules Agnostic Collections, an ethos for the hobby and a counter to miniatures agnostic games. So one way that I framed this entire video just now is in contrast to miniatures agnostic games. I don't have anything against miniatures agnostic games per se, and I actually really enjoy a lot of them and I play them. But I think there are some issues with the idea of miniatures agnosticism uh, at large that we need to address. And first of all is to understand that it's simply a marketing term. It is a way for rules designers and publishers to communicate to the customers that there are no official miniatures associated with it. Or if there are miniatures that they have associated with it, they don't want you to feel constrained to use that miniatures line. Or it is a way for them to distance themselves from business practices in the industry that they disagree with, by which I usually mean Games Workshop. However, for all that, it doesn't really tell you much about the game itself. Of the various games that describe themselves as miniatures agnostic, they kind of fall into four different camps, which are very different from each other. So first, you have the type that are off-brand Warhammer. So games like this would be one-page rules, and there are various games like Grimdark Futures or Age of Fantasy, or Ninth Age, which is just a version updated of the old Warhammer Fantasy rules. And that is very different from another type, which are games that are miniatures agnostic because they're kind of selling a unique aesthetic, and they're generally encouraging you to kit bash and build random weird armies within that. So games like this are Turnip 28, Sludge, and Gaslands. Unlike both of those, you have the games that encourage you or are set up in a way to where you are expected and encouraged to design your own warband or army from the ground up. You pick your models, you assign what special rules and stats go along with them, and you completely construct that army and you play with it. It's a very DIY thing to where they give you the system and the army is up to you. There's no codex, no army list. And if there are, they're meant to be guidelines. And then that is all contrasted from kind of this fourth group, which are historical games or incredibly generic fantasy and sci-fi games, to where everything reflected in it has a certain expected way that we imagine it to be. So historical games, obviously you can't put a patent on a patent tank. Military uniforms are not trademarkable items, at least not real-world military uniforms. And games like Oathmark, though they have their own miniatures associated with them, they present very kind of generic sense of what you would expect out of an elf army or an orc army. And because of that, they're miniatures agnostic, in large part because most miniatures of that line can fit into that category. And that's different from the previous three examples. And all of these problems aside, simply selling the games that the idea that the miniatures don't matter is slightly off the mark and misses the point of what makes games fun. Like I said before, I'm not saying I don't enjoy these types of games. You just can't build an ethos for the hobby around a marketing term. So if miniatures agnostic games misses the point because they're not really appreciating what makes miniatures games fun, I think that puts me in a place where I have to make an argument and explain my theory, at least, on what makes miniature gaming fun. And though that's very subjective, I'd argue that most people find a game fun for one of two reasons, and these are not mutually exclusive from each other. First is that the game itself is tactically interesting. What I mean by that is there's interplay between the decisions that each player makes and counterplay to that. Players have to and will, if they're going to be successful, evaluate the different risk for their options, and rarely is there going to be, or should there be, an optimal choice that they can make. So that's what I mean by a game being tactically interesting. Also, you have games that are narratively compelling, or are the cinematic experiences. And these are games that facilitate an emergent narrative that allows you to visualize what's happening on your toy soldier battlefield through like this humanized lens of the experience of your soldiers or of your general. And I don't know, you can help tell stories almost in a role-playing like way if you want to do that. But it also aids in visualizing the abstractions of the game. So what I mean by this as an example are when you get these really dramatic headshots in Battletech, or when you spin out of control and you crash into a boulder when you're playing Gaslands. So all of these things, both tactical interest and narrative cinematic experiences, are achieved through the mechanics of the game. I think it's important to highlight, though, that the mechanics and rules are not ends of themselves. The ends in themselves are the game being tactically interesting and the narrative cinematic experience, which the mechanics can enable. And it can aid these things. It can aid in tone, excitement, intrigue, but it can also distract you from what's happening on the tabletop. And when it's really poorly done, it's a filter that'll keep you from interacting with the fun parts of the game. So when you're gaming, the rules only deliver an experience. As a gamer, the experiences you want to have are expressed most deeply and intimately by the armies you choose to collect and build. If you want to test your mettle as a Napoleonic general, you're going to build a French corps from 1812 and see if you can win the Moscow or the Russian campaign. If you want to tell a story that is about a bunch of grimdark ne'er-do-wells, you're going to do some kit bashing of some Inc. 28 warbands. And if you think sadistic space elves are cool, you're going to buy an army of Dark Eldar or Dark Eldar adjacent. So I argue that conversely to what miniatures agnostic games imply, that the miniatures don't matter, it's all about the rules, the opposite is true. In many cases, the miniatures and why we choose those miniatures is the point entirely. So I'm really flipping the entire idea of miniatures agnostic games, as it manifests in different discussions and advertisements, on its head. I want the miniatures I collect to be agnostic to any particular game system, and then I use the miniatures I have and apply them to various games based on which ones I think are interesting at the time or what other people want to play. In short, I want to have game agnostic miniatures, or I think worded better, I want to have rules agnostic collection. And that's the title sequence, so roll credits. So I mentioned that one of the problems with miniatures agnostic games is you cannot frame an entire ethos of your hobby around that. But I think that's exactly what we can do with the idea of rules agnostic collections and approaching gaming and our hobby from that perspective. That being the case, this is my idea of what a rules agnostic ethos looks like, and I encourage you to take this and embrace it, and if you don't like it perfectly, adjust it and figure out a way to where you can take the same idea and make it work for you and your own gaming group. But first off is I want to prioritize creative expression. I want the armies and warbands that I create to be an expression of myself and my ideas and things that excite me. So that could be everything from being excited by a certain intellectual property and building my stormtrooper collection and painting those up, or it could be on the flip side, an expression of certain parts of history that I like, and it's an expression of uh, all the research I've done to paint the army so it looks correct, or what my idea of correct is. So I think that is a key point that we should all embrace, and then approach it from a way to where that creative expression is you sharing yourself, a bit of yourself, with the rest of the community, with the people on the game table with you. Like I see this as a very like friendly and intimate thing, to where when I bring an army to a table, I'm showing my opponent, or if it's a collaborative game, like the other people I'm playing with, like this is something I think is cool, and I want you to fight against them and share this experience with me. And I hope that other people also bring armies that their own creative expressions that they're excited about and they put effort into and they've thought about. And I think that would help really generate these unique, exciting experiences for everyone. And kind of to that end, I want people to be able to focus on collecting models that they find compelling. We are like a glutton for choice currently with how many options we have for different models. With 3D printing, the ability to design your own if you know how to do 3D modeling, or the various companies to where that allow you to kind of design your own miniature and they'll print it for you. To just so many companies that are out there that present you with an endless array of both historical and fantasy and science fiction uh, models. So, with all that's available to you, I think you should build the armies that you want and start from that point instead of building the armies that you feel like you have to buy and build because that is the standard in your area. That's what's expected for you to build. And lastly, is once you've done that, that's when you can go and you can find rules that allow you to play with those models to give you the experience you were after. And hopefully, doing that, you. Okay, so I think it is profoundly sad that this is a common experience for a lot of wargamers. When you get into a game, like typically more competitive scene games like Warhammer 40k, or this happens with War Machine, and you buy an army, you paint it up, you think they look cool, you put a lot of effort and love into the models, and then it turns out that you don't like the game, you don't like the way that those models play, and you're left with these miniatures that it seems like you had no use for. And I think that's a very disappointing feeling, and it's kind of one of the downsides of the hobby. I think that approaching the hobby from this rules agnostic ethos, it's going to mitigate the risk of that somewhat, because you're starting from just loving the models, and then once you love the models you have, then you can go out and find the games that are appropriate for it and for your experience. And in many ways, I think too, finding the models, using the models you like, and finding the rules you want will also lead you towards the other people who want to share in the hobby experience and in the hobby community that you do. And so you're more likely to come across like-minded hobbyists. So that kind of encapsulates the rules agnostic ethos. And like I said before, what I mean, in addition to like find the way that you want, is there are games where it gives you that tactical interest and the narrative cinematic potential that you're looking for. How then can we actually achieve this ethos, this aspiration we have? So I recommend that we approach army building and collecting miniatures as a bit of a creative process. And don't think of this as a process that has to be rigorously adhered to, but I think in general this is the way it'll go. And it starts with inspiration. Whatever inspires you to want to game. And then once you do that, you need to take whatever it is that inspired you, that idea of a certain battle or unit in history, or a certain type of unit that exists in like a science fiction universe, and you think about how that actually is going to function on the battlefield. And once you figure out a bit how it's actually going to fight, then you pick models that is going to fit your inspiration and fulfill that functionality. And once you've done that, that's when you can go out and find different rules that will give you the experience that you're after. So I'm going to take you through this process a couple of times with some examples to kind of show you what I mean, and maybe give you a starting place to where you can do it for yourself with your own current collection, and thinking about how you want to expand those models you have, or starting a new one from the ground up. So the first one we're going to do is a historical example. One reason I'm doing this is this process that I'm describing. This is really what historical gamers have been doing for decades, since the beginning, since the 60s, when the miniatures gaming hobby really kind of started on its own. So for this, historical inspiration is often going to be a book or a historical movie, or maybe just a historical time period that you're enthusiastic about. And so for this example here, we're going to go with a kind of militia skirmishing ranger-like combat in the French and Indian War. And the example book is Hodges Scouts, which goes over the history of a small colonial American like a militia unit. The great thing about historicals is the functionality is something that you can find pretty readily. Especially in modern era settings, you can look at the doctrine, and it'll tell you exactly how many tanks are in a platoon and how different squads are supposed to interact in different weapon systems. So the functionality is readily available to you. For earlier time periods, or if you're going for something a bit more irregular, like an insurgency, even in the modern era, you're going to have to extrapolate some on how that works based on your research, but you can still come up with a functionality. And once you've had that, then you can find the models you like, collect them, paint them up, and once you're at this point, there are a plethora of rules that can facilitate you playing this very narrow space of history. So, kind of doing a quick 30-minute search, here's 4 skirmish games or skirmish level games that let you play in the French and Indian War time period. All of these have dramatically different gameplay experiences. Some are more beer and pretzels. Some have greater levels of detail and historical research associated with them. But they're all available to you. And some of them are very well reviewed. I know a lot of people really love Blood and Plunder. If you really like Last of the Mohicans, and that book inspired you, Song of Drums and Tomahawks actually gives you rules to play through some of those scenarios. However, that's kind of how I see this process working, is going from inspiration and models, and then you have all these rules that you can play with. All right, so how might that work for a fictional game? So I've done this recently for myself in collecting an army, And I'm going to take you through an example of my process that I've gone through to build this army. And the inspiration started out with the Black Cauldron, specifically the Disney movie, but I also really like the Alexander Lloyd books growing up. I've always been fascinated by them. But I kind of wanted an army that resembled the Cauldron-born and the Horned King. So, that being the case, I imagined a little bit like the functionality that this would need. So, obviously, I want to have a leader that is befitting of the Horned King. I want the cauldron itself to be like represented on the tabletop. And then I want skeleton warriors and different things like that. So that kind of gave me an idea of what type of units I would want, and that informed my search. What I settled on was this. This is actually a picture of my collection up to this point. I'm probably going to expand it a little bit, but a lot of these are Oathmark miniatures, the skeletons and the revenants, and I thought that did a pretty good job of having a baseline undead horde army that had this kind of quasi-Celtic, very ancient history inspired aesthetic to it. So Alexander Lloyd's books and the aesthetic of the movie, it takes some hints from this. Is a reimagining of Welsh folklore, particularly of the Mabinogion. If you have read that, you can see the corollaries. Um, but anyway, so the Oathmark models were great for that, in part because a lot of their equipment is very inspired by the Latin material culture, which is generally ascribed to Celtic peoples, and the Urnfield culture, which sometimes thought to be a Bronze Age Proto-Celtic. So all that kind of came together. Additionally, I found some witches around a cauldron, and I painted those witches up in a color scheme somewhat inspired by the witches in the movie. And then I have like the green essence in the cauldron. And then, since also I'm going for like this pseudo-Celtic inspiration, I have a giant animated burning wickerman to be a monster that can accompany the army. Now, that all being the case, I can use these miniatures in just about any of these games. Actually, I would probably want a few more of them if I was going to play an Oathmark, but this is perfect for Hobgoblin when that comes out, hopefully soon. Dragon Rampant and Wily Games Bigger Battles, which is the Big Battles version of their really awesome skirmish system. You should check them out. Anyways, so that's how I recently applied this process to a fictional game or a fictional setting to have miniatures, and now I just have to take them and play any of these game systems with them. Fortunately, I've cultivated some interest in Hobgoblin amongst my local gaming group, so that's probably where I'm going to start. So lastly, we're going to run through this with IP-based fiction. And the reason why I want to go through this one separately is, unlike my previous example to where I was interpolating inspiration from a book and a movie, and a lot of the functionality and the models were very much on me to figure out how I was going to interpret and employ that in a game. IP-based collections, you have some of those are answered for you, but still you're going to start in the same place. You're going to be inspired by something. This could be Black Library books, it could be John Blanche art, it could be the Star Wars movies, BattleTech, maybe even the BattleTech TV show from the 90s. You're going to be inspired, but oftentimes, because they have all of this supporting documentation, like the old Weston Games army books that or role-playing books, or the codexes for Warhammer, there's kind of an objective answer to what a unit that you might want to represent from this world would have. So, for example, if we are inspired as kind of this picture implies, is if we're inspired by the Ultramarines and we want to have an Ultramarine company, we can see what an Ultramarine company consists of, what they actually have available to them. And then we can use that to inform the models we purchase. So we're buying a collection that represents this experience we want to have, being a company master or company captain for a Space Marine chapter, or in a Space Marine chapter, I suppose. And then we can play games. Now, I suppose obviously IP-based games that are rooted in other game systems like Warhammer 40k, you can play the actual game. You can play 10th edition 40k. But then, like I said, there's an entire strain of the miniatures agnostic games which are simply about making rules that you can use Games Workshop miniatures in. So I actually really enjoy Grimdark Futures. That's what I play mostly. However, these are not the only two options. I think it's also worth considering going back in time and playing a previous edition that maybe spoke to you a little bit more and it gave you the gameplay experience you liked. If anything, it's a bit of a nostalgia trip. So this is just kind of an example of how I would approach this army building creative process for something that's IP based. Notice that's a little bit different from how people normally talk about building a Space Marine army to play 40k, to where it's about finding your meta list and looking at different net lists and determining how you're going to seize your objectives. It's flipping this on the head a little bit to where there are objectives, and because you are a Space Marine Company commander with your 6 tactical squads, like 2 Devastator squads or however many, and a couple of dreadnoughts, because those are your assets, you build your army from those assets and figure out how to accomplish those objectives with limited means. And I think that gives you a bit more of a narrative experience, but it's a bit more grounded and less gamey. So I think rather fairly, members of this hobby who've been around for a while might want to accuse me of being too optimistic and simplifying this whole process too much, because there's a lot that previous slide did not account for. I made it seem like, yeah, build a collection and then you can do anything with it, any game. But then they would point out to me, and rightly so, a lot of games have very particular requirements, such as whether or not they're based singly or if they're multi-based units. What size of bases? Or are they rectangular bases or are they circles? So all these things can be very important to a game. And it can also limit the interoperability of your miniature collection from one game to the other. So I think one thing we have to talk about to make this work and understand is genre. So games, like literature and movies, have genre. And this is a term that communicates to the buyer that what they're reading, watching, or playing in a gameplay experience, what they can expect. Now, this can be further broken down into several subgenre that provides more clarity. So, for example, you have fantasy, but you can also have dark fantasy, high fantasy, low fantasy, young adult fantasy. It's all kind of endless. But then there are also specific subgenre that apply to games, even though those other literary subgenre can also be used to describe a lot of our settings. So some gaming specific genre will be like skirmish, fast play, mass battles, simulationist. Those things are genres of games or subgenre of games that can further describe an expectation of what the play experience will be like. So some examples of how this can be used to communicate is if we look at both Moretime and Frostgrave. They're both fantasy games, and even more so, they're both fantasy skirmish games, to give them both, so they both fall into that same kind of subgenre. However, we can distinguish between them if we describe Wartime as a dark, low fantasy game, because it has this really grim, John Blanche-inspired aesthetic, and Magic's involvement in the tabletop itself is pretty rare. You don't generally have a wizard until much later in the game, in a campaign. But Frostgrave, we could very easily call that a high fantasy setting, in large part because the entire point of the game is wizards running around casting spells. That is why the game exists. That's why it's fun. So I think if you understand what subgenre of games your collection is oriented towards, that's going to help inform your decisions on how you collect your game, how you collect your miniatures, and pick out games that are suitable for them. But also on the other end, there is what I term supergenres, and these are grouped because a lot of different genres in miniatures gaming can kind of fall under them, but each of these have similar considerations on how you approach collecting them. They will typically have a set number of scale basing similarities between these different, quote, supergenre, end quote. Well, I'm quoting myself, but anyways, there's enough of these similarities to where I feel like I can describe to you a way to think about actually constructing your army in an informed way to where it's going to be very flexible to other games that fall within that supergenre. So that being the case, I really have three different supergenre. There is the pre-modern / fantasy, the early modern / flintlock fantasy, and sometimes steampunk, and then the modern and sci-fi supergenre. All right, from there, with pre-modern and fantasy, what I really mean are these are games that are set in a battlefield context where there's relatively low organization and high heroics. Now, I know that there are a number of historical enthusiasts who will be up in arms talking about how there are actually there's a great deal of complexity on the medieval battlefield, and you're right, there are. However, it manifests itself oftentimes outside of the battlefield, in like how armies are structured and then recombined before battle. Uh, and once you're on the battlefield, you have your left, your right, and your center. And a lot of armies of the time period didn't deviate far from that, and if they did, they're the exception rather than the rule. And high heroics, I think a large part of the expectation of playing these things is your leaders matter, both in terms tactically, to where the kings and generals only have a small span of control, so their location and activity is extremely important, but also from a very narrative and cinematic standpoint, if you want to deal with like something heroic and mythical, like Hector and Achilles, their presence on the battlefield is a game changer. So examples of what falls under this is obviously ancient and medieval warfare, Tolkien-esque fantasy, and also Age of Myth gaming. So like if you want to do kind of like one of the examples I gave earlier, if you want to do gaming set in the Iliad to where you have Homeric heroes clashing, which is really awesome, and I kind of want to build that one day. This is a pretty good guideline of what you're going to be going after, what falls under the pre-modern and fantasy supergenre. So for the early modern flintlock fantasy and sometimes steampunk supergenre, and I probably need to find a more concise way to title these, is first, this is when you have the proliferation of guns and the systemization of war. So they're simultaneously and somewhat linked, but they're both important on their own ways. In the early modern era, so we're talking about like moving into the Renaissance, you have all the technological advancements that come up with gunpowder. Eventually, you have socket bayonets and all these things that military historians will list off readily. But additionally, you have, and I'd argue more importantly in many cases, you would have an increased professionalization of armies, like, and systemization in how warfare is conducted. So this is when you have the tercios and you start to have organized pike and shot war bands. There are manuals that start to be published regularly where people make arguments on what military doctrine ought to be and how to run a company, how to fight a battle. All this becomes more systematized, and because of that, battlefields become more complex places. And that changes the nature of the games you're going to play somewhat, compared to something that's set in a more medieval or medieval-inspired setting. So examples of this are pike and shot games, Napoleonics, but also moving into the fantasy era. This is where you get into like Howl's Moving Castle type of game in fantasy settings, to where it is this very black powder inspired time frame, but magic is an important part, or a part at all, of the setting. And also steampunk, and I say sometimes steampunk, because this is a type of steampunk to where like machines of war and airships might be present, but they're not all-consuming. So if you have a version of steampunk to where everyone's in a giant steam-powered battle mech, and that is the entire way warfare is fought, it's falling slightly outside of this category, and it's more of just a science fiction game with a steampunk filter. But anyways, that does pull us over to what I mean by modern and science fiction supergenre. And this is when you have war machines, lots of rapid fire weapons, and flight. And even if some of these things are not explicitly in the rules, like for example, if you don't have aircraft dogfighting on top of the table, implications of these elements of warfare go into the design of the game. So with flight, now you have to think about things such as like airborne or air assault operations and how that's going to affect gameplay, or perhaps even delivery using air as a munitions delivery system, so like bombing and strafing runs. All of those things can go into what make modern and science fiction gaming feel unique from things in other eras. So you have modern war, and I'm using that not I'm actually using it fairly narrowly technically, but I don't mean just contemporary conflicts, but I'm also pushing that all the way back to World War I and World War II, fitting into this category. But this can also move a little bit into the future, so we're talking about like near future hypothetical type simulations and war games. Then obviously you have science fiction and all that encompasses that, and cyberpunk, which is really just a type of science fiction that is has a specific feel to it. But I think it's worth bringing up to be distinct. But that's what I mean by the modern and sci-fi supergenre. So in separate videos, I can go into more detail about the considerations and the decisions you can make about building armies in certain supergenres. In those videos, I will present you different options on how many miniatures to collect and how many of those miniatures you should consider arraying into a unit. Also, different options for scale and basing, and when you're going to start purchasing models for your collection, what you want to consider based on what type of games you think you want to have with your collection. So those videos will come out in the future. So please stay tuned. Thank you so much for watching this video. I also know that there are other things that I did not get into at all, like naval, aerial, and space warfare. I'm still fairly novice in those types of games, so I'm trying to collect my thoughts at them before I broadcast to the world. So perhaps I will get more into those later if that's something you're interested in. And also, if you like this idea, please consider sharing this video to members of your gaming group. I think that if everyone started approaching miniatures gaming in this way, or something similar at least, it would make the entire hobby a little bit healthier and a little bit more enjoyable. Till next time, farewell.